Hi, and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I am very fortunate this morning to be sitting down with Rosie Lyon, vulnerability specialist. Rosie will explain a bit more about her role and all the various things she does. So over to you, Rosie.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. It's lovely to be here today. So, yeah, as I say, I'm Rosie. I am a vulnerability specialist. So I look after lots of different types of vulnerabilities in every way, shape, or form, which is something I thoroughly enjoy in the banking sector. Before I was in that role, my main passion was domestic abuse, which I've now focused more on the financial and economic abuse part of it due to working in the banking industry. So I look generally at what we can do to support staff and customers, and what things that we can do to help them through their journey to rebuild their life. So I'm now qualified as a financial and economic abuse specialist, and I volunteer for multiple charities, one of my favourite being Surviving Economic Abuse, which solely focuses on economic abuse as well. So that's just a little whistle-stop tour about me there.
And I think, thank you very much. And that's like, wow. And I think one of the biggest questions, isn't it, is, we hear about financial abuse as one of the many kind of forms of abuse, but then there's also economic abuse. So would you explain a bit of like the difference between the two?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at it as umbrella as such, so domestic abuse is at the top, and then as a little spider web as such, you then have economic abuse, and under economic abuse is financial abuse, where that normally gets confused. And it's because economic abuse wasn't a recognised form of abuse until it was added into the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. Which is brilliant because economic abuse is more broader than financial abuse. So financial abuse involves an individual misusing money, which limits and controls an individual's current and future actions, which includes using credit cards without their permission, putting things in their partner's name, or, it's not just relationships, it could be family members, carers, in their name, or gambling with family assets. Economic abuse is, as I say, a lot broader. So it's when it has control over someone's economic situation. So that can include restricting access to essential resources such as food and clothing, telling them how they can travel if they can and cannot have a job, putting debt in their name, coercing them as such to get out debt. So lending in their name or in an individual's name, and all different things. There's so many different varieties of it, but yeah, that's sort of the difference, really.
Yeah, because it's terrifying, isn't it? I think when you're in that situation, and that's your norm, isn't it? Not being able to access funds, or a lot of the time as well, you end up isolated from family and friends because you've had to move because of the financial issues, whatever they may be. And I think a lot of the time victims haven't got a clue where to go for support. Where do you go for help? And sometimes I think as well, when the relationship, if it has ended, and if the victim has managed to leave that situation, and not everybody does, then sometimes, you're tied in with a mortgage, or, there's all those kind of aspects. And I think that's a big one for me is, and what I want for obviously the website to have, and for what I want You Don't Own Me to have, is as many resources on there as possible so people know where to go. But, where do you go for that kind of help and support?
Yeah, exactly. So with financial and economic abuse, it normally comes hand in hand with a different type of abuse. So say physical or, emotional. Sometimes there's no physical abuse involved, because obviously that is the myth that everything domestic abuse related is physical. So it could be emotional, it could be a variety of different abuses that come hand in hand. And financial and economic abuse is really hard to spot sometimes. Using examples of if a partner, for instance, is dependent on their partner for financial means, so whether they ask to borrow money or to use the joint account and use more money than what they should, an individual in that relationship may think that that's normal. They may think, this is a relationship, what's mine is his and his is mine, and vice versa, and for same-sex couples as well. So they won't see it as a form of abuse. They might feel it as being normal, you know, and it's kind of like where we see coercive control, where people are controlled in the aspect of getting a loan out in a joint name, if they, you know, and they might not want that loan, but they might think, oh, well, I'm actually helping my partner. Or as I say, it doesn't just happen in, you know, relationships. It could be like family as well. Like, I'm just helping that individual. That's my role. That's what I'm there to do, to help and support them. So it's really hard to see that. And, you know, now it's been formally recognised, like economic abuse, and financial and economic abuse is spoken about a lot more now, which is brilliant, because, you know, from previous years, you've seen that, you know, there was a little bit on different websites or different information about financial abuse, but there wasn't as much information there to whether you'd think it's actually abuse or not. So it's really great. We've come quite far. And as I say, Surviving Economic Abuse, the leading charity, they're the only charity in the UK that speaks solely on economic abuse. So they're a second line charity. So they have lots of different resources, lots of different information on their website. It's brilliant. They have also they have like forums for survivors and different things like that. It's really, really good. They also partnered with Money Advice Plus, and there's the financial helpline on there as well, where individuals can ring up, and if they are experiencing financial abuse or they're in debt due to, you know, different elements of that, then they can ring up and get some advice on that as well. And also, one of the main places that people should go to but don't realise to go to, because it's not the first thing that you think of, is going to your bank or the financial provider when it comes to, as you say, like joint mortgages, when you've fled that relationship or, you know, left that relationship, and, you know, you've still got this joint application and one individual is refusing to pay, you know, refusing to sell the property, making things difficult for that individual, then obviously that is a form of financial and economic abuse. And the only people that can help support with that are banks. And, you know, there's lots of different things banks can do. There's obviously a variety of different banks, and all banks, we do similar things, but not all the same. It's not set across the board. There's no sort of regulatory guidance where we have to all do exactly the same thing. So unfortunately, it is going to be sometimes a bit different from some banks to another. I'd love it if one day they were just all consistent, they all did exactly the same thing, but, you know, we're not there. So, you know, and that's where you come into the Financial Abuse Code, which we discussed previously. So talking about the Financial Abuse Code, it was set up by UK Finance, which is an organisation which the majority of banks follow or sit on, and they brought out the Financial Abuse Code in 2021, and it was it's not mandatory, so it's for whatever banks can and had capacity and wanted to sign up to this code and become a signatory of it, was to confirm that, you know, they basically pledge that they'll do more for their customers. And there's different pillars, there's different things in there. It can be found on UK Finance's website. It's public, so it's fair, anybody can see that as well. And it also gives a list of the banks and building societies that are actually part of the Financial Abuse Code as well, which is really good. And it's something, you know, because if you feel like you're being let down by your bank or not getting the support that you need, and if they're part of that, then of course you can then raise that, you know. And it's something that I do say to people, if they need someone posting or are stuck, that you can get this information, it is there. But what banks can do, generally quite a lot of the high street banks more have more facility. So whether that is that you can disclose that you're experiencing domestic abuse, like normally, like your normal routes are on the phone, but some have sort of web chats. Some banks as well, you can do it via your online banking or mobile banking, send a secure message as well. A few banks as well have specialised teams, vulnerability teams, where, you know, they have a dedicated helpline, so they'll be trained to deal with domestic abuse. And as I say, different banks, like banks are completely different, but the majority of them do have like the normal sort of ground. So they'll be, they'll have training from, say, Surviving Economic Abuse or other charities on domestic abuse.
Yeah.
And they'll be able to support their customers, whether that be to help them open a bank account if they don't have identification and proof of address. You normally
Right.
need like a set, say a passport or a driving license, and say that's in a property that you can't access anymore. The majority of banks have different procedures now where you don't need to have that information. It can be done differently, which is brilliant, because we all need a basic bank account, right, to actually live. So, and especially if you was in an abusive relationship and it was joint and you only had that joint account, you need to have your own account. So that's brilliant. And different things as well as looking at like changing address, or updating addresses so it's a refuge address, if you're in refuge, or in a temporary accommodation.
Amazing.
As well, different things like that. Lots of different things, really. I was looking at all the different sort of supports that other banks do offer, and it's great. You see lots of different things in the media. TSB, they have safe spaces. There's quite a few banks that do now, but they were one of the first. And safe spaces are amazing. You can go into a branch physically, and you can be put into a secure room. They can give you the support that you need, whether that be that you use their phone to ring the police or whatever, and then they can help in other ways, which is brilliant. You had HSBC that did the financial abuse campaign, where it was a woman that was tied to, she was tied up, because you feel like you're physically tied and you're trapped. In that. So that was brilliant. And in Starling Bank, they've just brought out the abusive payment reference. So another example is, obviously, once you're out of that relationship, for instance, if you're getting child maintenance, or if they have to pay you for whatever reason, whether that be the mortgage loans, whatever, and then they'll send it and they'll put abusive references, whether that reference be abusive that we could see that it's abusive, or it could be something that would trigger an individual. So now they have the capacity that they can hide it. So, you don't have to see any of the references, which is amazing. And, and Monzo as well, they have safe spaces online, because they're an online only bank. Not the only bank online, but, like, but so there's loads of like different things that different banks do, and we do like lots of different signposting to charities that are inclusive to all in domestic abuse in general. So obviously you've got like the Mankind Initiative, and Men's Advice Line, and you've got Women's Aid and Refuge for female and children. You've got like Gallup, which is the LGBTQ helpline. You've got Respect as well, all these different charities. And it's just making sure that we're all inclusive. So all these individuals, whoever you are, and whatever part of abuse that you're going through, that you've got a certain charity that can support you. And we signpost to all different things like that. So that's just obviously a few things. But as I say, I always recommend to people, once they feel comfortable to, because it don't mean that you have to. And not everybody's comfortable doing that. Don't matter what gender you are. Some people are more open to talking about it, whereas others aren't. And that's absolutely fine. But, if you go onto your bank's website and type in domestic abuse, you will be able to have a look, and there'll be stuff, if you don't want to speak to them now, there'll be different resources and things to consider, and different, like, if it's about your online banking, how to keep that safe and stuff like that, different things on their website. Lloyd's at the moment, that I've seen, they have an quick exit button on their domestic abuse page. That's something that's normally just on the charity pages. One of the first in the banks to have that quick exit thing. And that's brilliant, because then if you're nervous about looking at that and you're still living with an individual that is abusive, then you can quickly exit that page. That's brilliant. So you can have a little look on your bank's website. And then if you want to disclose, then obviously you disclose in whatever way your bank can facilitate that, or how you'd feel comfortable to do that. And then ask them, what support can you provide me? It'll be on their website, majority of the stuff anyway, but what else can you do for me? And whether that be, if you are in any form of debt, as well, making sure that there's a procedure that, you know, we're only making sure that you don't have to repeat your story, making sure that
that's a
you
big
know,
one, isn't it? That is a
yeah,
big one.
that is a big one, and I can't guarantee that it's going to be the same with every financial or any organisation for that matter, that you don't have to repeat your story. But you know, that should be a basic common knowledge. And then even like with debt, you know, if people are worried about debt, or you know, having that conversation with your bank and saying, like, what can you do to support me? And as I say, all banks are completely different, but they may have things where they might be able to give you a bit of breathing space, you know, so you don't have to pay for a certain period of time. Or it could be a case that they make sure there's no sort of, they shouldn't be anyway, but fees added and stuff like that. Or, you know, consider how they can support you, and whether, if you want it to go into repossession, say like property, or if you want your loan to default and go to a debt collectors or whatever. So sometimes that's the only way out. It is the only way out, that they support you during that time, and making sure that they check in and stuff like that. But as I say, being open and honest with your bank, you'll be able to see what they can do to support you. And as I said, you know, they all do different things, and some do some things, some don't do some things. At the moment, you know, they're still doing loads of continuous things to, you know, keep putting stuff into place. Like, you know, we've come a long way. You know, back in say 2019, you were lucky to even see a bank that had a web page on domestic abuse. So we're coming a long way. Small steps that make big impacts for some customers. But talking about banks as well, obviously, and it's one thing that I do always say, I don't, even though I work in banking, it's like anything, if you're not happy with the service that you've been provided,
that's what I was just,
if you don't feel supported, or if, you know, something's happened and you're just like, this isn't right, like, I don't feel like this is, you know, you could have done better, then complain. And, you know, having anxiety, for instance, some people have severe anxiety after abuse or during abuse, or other different factors that they might feel uncomfortable to complain. But a lot of banks, you can complain online. You can do it online, and you can get a response via email. So you don't even need to speak.
Not doing the face,
no face to face, no over the phone, no having to speak to a human being. If you don't feel comfortable to do that. So, you know, every bank's website will have a complaints procedure. They'll say how you can complain. Again, majority of banks, you can complain via, obviously, writing, telephone, or they normally have forms on their webpage. Some banks or financial institutions that aren't banks may just be a case that you can just email, or, you know, but it will say on the website, and then you can do your complaint, and then they'll come back. They have to come back within, I think they're all the same, but roughly 56 days.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so I think that's sort of a rough estimate. I mean, some banks could be different, but generally banks that I have dealt with before have 56 days. And, you know, they have to do that, and they'll keep you updated via text, email, to say, like, you know, we are still working on your complaint. And, you know, then they'll come back with something in whatever way, shape or form to whatever your complaint's about. And, you know, it's important to say to people that if you're not satisfied with your complaint, you know, the way that they've dealt with it, or the way they've rectified that situation, and you still don't feel supported, then you can escalate it. And by escalating that, you can do that through the Financial Ombudsman Service. And you can do that all online, you know, so you can do that all online, and then, then they take it forward, and they're like what I'd call the top dogs there. So, you know,
the buck stops there.
That's it, whether their responses goes. But no, I do think as well, actually, if you're not happy with their complaint, then you can re-complain back to them. But again, I'm not too familiar with that part, but I know that they're the top. But I 100% recommend it, because not only will it help yourself if you're going through abuse and, you know, you don't feel supported, but also, and not that you don't have to do it for this reason, but obviously one of the things that they then will do, they can look at that complaints information and they can be like, right, well, that was a fouling, what are we going to do about it? And they can learn from that, to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So there's loads of different things that banks can do, and charities that can help and stuff like that, even just to talk it through and stuff like that. But we do listen, we do believe, and we do, we do support.
So I think that's one thing, isn't it? And that's when it's difficult, when it's so, like you say, it's coming a long way in the last few years. And I think one of the things when you have an understanding of domestic abuse is no story is too strange. I will always say with domestic abuse, truth is stranger than fiction, because you will have people say to you, no, that can't possibly, no, I don't know. And yeah, actually that's and it's so hard that's the scary thing, is actually getting people to believe that this is actually what's happened to me. I've been coerced into a ridiculous loan, or a credit scheme of some sort. I paid for everything in the house, and it was all done on a card with a 29.6% APR, but it's all in my name. But I realized now I was coerced into it. It's so hard for people to come forward and think, will I be believed? Will anybody care, sort of thing. And I think now that message is getting out there slowly through different banks, actually, yes, you will be listened to, and you will be taken seriously. And actually, we do care. That's the big
no, definitely. And unfortunately, as years go on, like, you see more and more cases, like all banks would see, like, not speaking on behalf of them, but all banks would see cases, and even though people's stories are very similar, they're all different in their own way. But there will be similar instances where the same sort of situations happened. And unfortunately, very sadly to say, it does happen quite a lot. The statistics are there, how many people experience domestic abuse in whatever way, shape or form. And, it should be on a basis that people are believed, whatever situation they're in, whatever gender they are, whatever, whoever they are, that there's an element that you believe that person and you support that person for whatever they do.
Absolutely. And I think I'm just thinking now ahead with the website, a good one would be to have as many resources as possible. So I'm going to come to you and get as many as I can, because like you're saying, obviously SEA, various charities, I'd love to get as many links on the resources page as possible, to be able to say, look, this is where you can go, this is the information. And like you say, signposting people to various banks, etc. It'd be lovely, like I say, to have one day where it's all under one big umbrella and everybody does the same thing. But at least for now, things are changing slowly. If, like I say, a few years ago, domestic abuse wouldn't have appeared on any banking website, app, anything. You wouldn't have wouldn't have been there to even discuss. But I think so, one thing I do is I ask every professional 2 questions, just to see from their perspective. So it's more of a generic question, but I just thought it's really good at the so that everyone can sort of either listen, watch, and then to get the different sort of answers from professionals, which is interesting. A lot of the time you're all quite similar in the answers, but and they're very, very basic, but kind of like how can we break down the barriers in talking about domestic abuse from your kind of professional opinion, would you say? Because it's a tough one, isn't it? Talking about so taboo a subject.
It is a very taboo subject. It shouldn't be a taboo subject, but it is a taboo subject in various different organisations. I think it's making sure that from an inclusion and diversity point of view, understanding that it happens to so many people, and within your workplace there's probably going to be people that have experienced that, or are near to people that have experienced that before, and they aren't speaking up. And the reason sometimes why people don't speak up is because there's not support there, or they have the fear that they won't be believed. And if these so banks, for example, any organisation doesn't do any awareness on that, or any conversations on that, then then no one will ever speak about it. It's all about raising the awareness of it, whether that be individuals that have experienced domestic abuse and are happy to do so, sharing their story, because stories are so impactful that people are like, wow, I didn't even realise that was a thing. Or getting specialist charities in to do little webinars even on the topic. And, we have like, the Domestic Abuse Awareness Month and stuff like that, doing things around that and raising awareness internally in the workplace on that, to get people to have them conversations and start to talk about that. Because once it starts and everybody, starts, and even like, if you have LinkedIn, if you have social media, and obviously it's not triggering for someone to read anything that's domestic abuse related, but seeing something and even just giving it a like, because then it comes up on other people's, news feeds, and then it's like, oh, what's this? And then it starts rolling and all stuff like that. So like it's about like being open about it, and just wanting to raise that awareness, and even sharing them charities that are there, and having policies in workplaces, because then people have the opportunity to talk about it, to ask questions, and it's fine to ask questions.
Exactly, because 100%, like you say as well, how many, if you think of the statistics, how many people will be in a work environment, if you work with, say, hundreds, thousands of people, depending on the size of your organization, there will be people within that organization who are impacted by domestic abuse, even if it's not themselves directly. It might be a family member, it may be a friend that they know, maybe the work colleague, and that's the thing that I always think that needs kind of pushing constantly, is it is that massive. I did a post yesterday just talking about it's none of my business, when people say, oh, it's none of my business talk about abuse, but it's everybody's business. And I know it sounds cheesy saying that, but it is, because if we don't all start talking about it, if we don't all admit that it can happen to anybody, doesn't matter who you are, it can happen to anyone, and it can happen within your own family. And quite often you don't even know it's happening to you, because like we just said before, that's your normal, having to ask to use the credit card, or not being allowed to, or having to ask to be able to go out and buy food, or being restricted on what you can buy to eat or whatever. It's so much bigger than I think we realize as society as a whole. And I think that's the thing I would love to change, is that idea that it's pigeonholed into, there's only this type of person that will experience domestic abuse, because it's not. It's so much bigger than that, and doing things like this hopefully will bring that more to the forefront. But I think you've already answered the other question, but it was going to be, why do we find it so hard to talk about? But like you were saying, it's the belief aspect, isn't it?
I mean, I think sometimes it's hard to speak about because people don't even know it's a thing, which obviously it happens to so many people. And I see it plastered everywhere about domestic abuse, but obviously I follow everything domestic abuse related. But if you like, and that's fine, if you don't understand or know really domestic abuse, that's absolutely fine, because if you haven't had, fortunately, haven't had experienced it yourself, or haven't had anybody else that's experienced it, then why would you know, unless someone else has spoken about it? But being able to openly say, well, I actually don't really know much about it, and being open to being educated about it, then that's another person. But there's other things, people don't speak about it because obviously they get the fear of they're not going to be believed. And that's why I think it's so important to make sure the support systems are out there, especially in the workplace. So because you spend the majority of your life at work. Well, it feels like that anyway. Spend the majority of your life at work, so you should be able to get the support that you need within work. And if that workplace hasn't got that support, or hasn't got that awareness, then 9 times out of 10 someone's not really going to speak up.
No.
And it's not, and we see it all the time with any sort of vulnerability, that in any sort of organisation, people start listening when someone, like one of their own, has experienced something, and it is generally always survivors, like victim survivors of things that bring that actual change, and in their workplace, above and beyond, that actually bring the change that is required. It shouldn't just be down to them, but their situation is invaluable, because they have such an impactful story, and they're so brave, and people that do that, it's just amazing.
That's so true. And I think that's, where things will change. The more people that do speak out and say, and it's feeling that validation, I think, is a massive part of it. And hopefully with the website, that's what that seems to be achieving at the moment, is that, victims and survivors saying, well, actually, I can relate to what this podcast is about, or I can relate to that guest blog, because at the end of the day, you know, they're not on their own. It is true. It's, you know, you're not going mad. That's what I always used to say is, you know, I'm going mad. No, you're not going mad at all. It is, unfortunately. And that's where you don't want to get to. It'd be lovely to think that society could change to the point where it isn't getting to that point where it is. I wouldn't say too late. For some people, obviously it is, and it's horrendous, you know, and it's devastating beyond words when we, you know, even talk about things like domestic homicide. But if you never want it to get to the point where somebody has to be a survivor, you know, it would be lovely to think that we could take that step back and go, you don't even have to be a victim in the first place because you're educated and understand the impacts that abuse has, you know, and there's a long way to go with that. But just things like, you know, with the banks, it's amazing to see how much is changing, and that gives you hope. That gives you kind of confidence that things are heading in the right direction. And it will take time because it's something that's been so embedded into society for so long that it is going to take a long time to make those changes. But gradually and slowly, you know, organizations are starting to see it for what it is, and actually, it does have a voice, and, you know, victims do have the right to say, you know, enough's enough. So I think it's amazing what you do. I think it's incredible. I do.
I do love my job.
See, that's all you want, isn't it? That's all you want. And I think as well, when you see the positive results that come out of it, then that is, and knowing that you've supported people, I mean, God, what more is there to life? Apart from a good holiday. Apart from a good holiday now and again, but apart from that, oh no, thank you so much, because it's so important. And I will, after, I'm going to grab some resources from you and get those on the website so that people know where to go to get that support that they need around financial and economic abuse. And that kind of differentiation between the two is really important as well, to understand the difference. So thank you so much for taking the time this morning. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. No problem. And I'll see you soon. Thank you.